Claire slammed the voided check on the table. "You can't cut out family. I'm your daughter-in-law." Nora slid the will across in silence. "Final, witnessed, unbreakable. One clause, Claire. Contest me, and you get nothing." Claire's voice cracked. Evan said nothing. "And Nora?" She sipped her tea, eyes steady. "Inheritance doesn't reward noise. It remembers respect." "All right. Before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from." She said it with a smirk, like I was too poor to notice and too old to care. Nora Judith Bennett adjusted the neckline of her cardigan as she stepped onto the porch of her son's craftsman-style home, her shoes making no sound on the clean concrete. The smell of rosemary roast drifted from the kitchen window, filtered with laughter. Claire's laugh, sharp and bright like glass against tile. She rang the bell, even though she had a key. Claire insisted on boundaries. Evan opened the door, half distracted, hugging her with one arm, the other still holding his phone. "Hey, Mom, you made it." "Right on time, as always," she said, her voice light. Claire breezed in from the kitchen, red-lipped and barefoot, a stemless wine glass in hand. Her eyes scanned Nora, pausing at the cardigan, a thick wool blend, forest green, slightly faded at the cuffs. The cardigan had once belonged to Henry, Nora's husband, who had gifted it to her their first Christmas in the old house. She'd worn it to his memorial, too. Claire's nose twitched. "Wow," Claire said, smiling too widely. "Your clothes smell like they came from a dumpster." The room fell into a vacuum. Evan glanced up, froze for a second, then gave a low chuckle, half apology, half avoidance. He didn't correct his wife, didn't look at his mother either. Nora's lips curved into a practiced smile. "Ah, well, I suppose that's one way to say vintage." She folded her hands, ignoring the warmth rising in her cheeks. Claire turned, satisfied. "Dinner's in 10. Hope you're hungry." Evan motioned toward the dining room as if trying to soften it. "We opened the Pinot you like." "I'm fine, thank you." Nora's voice was steady, thin as tracing paper. She walked past him and took her usual seat, the one closest to the window. The meal passed with talk of Evan's promotion, Claire's bridal shower planning for her younger sister, and what color linens they'd be ordering for the engagement party. No one asked Nora about the new book she was reading, or how retirement felt after 40 years at the reference desk. When dessert was offered, she declined. "Too much sugar keeps me up," Claire quipped. "So does mothball smell." This time, Evan didn't even blink. Nora stood slowly, chair legs scraping the wood just enough to hush the room. "Thank you for dinner. I'll let myself out." She didn't slam the door, didn't rush to the car. Instead, she walked calmly down the brick path, one step at a time, as if absorbing the cold spring air could freeze the sting before it spread. Back home, the silence was familiar, comforting. The scent of sandalwood from a half-burnt candle still lingered. She took off her shoes, hung up the cardigan, and boiled water in the old copper kettle Henry had insisted was worth the wait. She poured her tea, black, unsweetened, took it to the living room, sat down, and turned on the lamp with the cracked shade. Her laptop blinked to life as if it had been waiting. She didn't go to her inbox or the weather or her bookmarks. She opened her documents folder and scrolled down until she found it. Last Will and Testament. Original. Her hand hovered over the trackpad. She clicked. The document opened with a polite legal flourish. Nora read the first lines slowly, like she was shelving them back at the library. "Being of sound mind. Full faith and confidence in my son." She sipped her tea, then set it down, carefully, deliberately, and began typing. "I, Nora Judith Bennett, being of sound mind, make the following changes." She begins typing, "I, Nora Judith Bennett, being of sound mind, make the following changes." She mocked my sweater, but never opened the safe behind my coats. The morning after the dinner, Nora moved quietly through her home like someone walking through a library after hours. Measured, intentional, reverent. The sun filtered through the front windows, dust motes swirling above the hardwood like specks of thought refusing to settle. She carried her teacup with both hands, even though it was empty now. Just something to hold. The cardigan was folded over the back of a chair, still holding the faint scent of sandalwood and old pine drawers. She didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, she moved to the hallway closet. It was narrow, painted in a soft cream that hadn't yellowed thanks to her obsessive care. She pulled the cord hanging from the single bulb overhead. A warm glow spilled onto the orderly rows of coats, her trench, a parka from LL Bean, 2 wool wraps in neutral tones. Her closet was like her life, modest, well-preserved, and deliberately quiet. She pushed aside a row of hangers and knelt, her knees cracking softly against the cedar floor. Behind the coats, where no visitor would ever look, was a small wall-mounted safe, half covered by a garment bag she hadn't opened in years. She tapped the code in from memory. 3-2-1-9-4-5, Henry's birthday, her anniversary, Evan's birth year. The lock clicked. Inside were 3 black boxes stacked like nesting dolls. The top one held U.S. Treasury bonds, some so old they were still in paper. The next, manila envelopes labeled with ticker symbols, TSLA, AMZN, and a few she knew had gone public long before anyone cared. The third box was heavier, more precious. It contained the legacy her husband had built while wearing that cardigan, shares in a clean energy startup he had believed in before people stopped laughing at solar panels. She placed them carefully on the closet floor and sat back on her heels. $2.7 million. That was the last total Helen had confirmed, not counting the house. Nora had never felt like she owned money. She protected it. She didn't need people to know she had it. She needed to know it couldn't be used to insult her. Claire had once made a comment over brunch, loud enough for Nora to pretend not to hear, something about how Evan had married into maintenance, how not everyone had a mother-in-law who came with their own flood insurance. That had stuck with Nora in a quiet way. She rose slowly, her knees stiff. On the top shelf, behind an old hat box and a box of holiday cards, sat a file folder yellowed at the edges. She pulled it down. Original will, 2008, was written across the front in Henry's handwriting, steady, methodical block letters. She opened it on the floor of the closet, cross-legged now like she used to sit when she'd read to Evan at night. There it was in black and white. Sole beneficiary, Evan Miles Bennett. Spouse. Deceased. No mention of Clare. Back then, it had made sense. Clare was new, still trying too hard to belong. Henry had barely known her. They had decided to revise the will once the couple had children. That revision never came. Nora ran her fingers along the page, her nails short, clean. "That ends now," she whispered. She stood brushing dust from her pants and returned everything to the safe, except the folder. That she placed gently on her writing desk in the study. Back at the laptop, she refreshed her email. A reply had come through, time-stamped 7:03 a.m., from Helen Marks-esque. Subject, revision request. Nora, yes, of course. Come in tomorrow. Bring everything. Helen. Nora exhaled, sharp and shallow. Everything. She closed the laptop. The folder sat there like a sealed verdict. The cardigan remained untouched on the chair, soft and heavy with memory. Let them think her clothes were old. She had closets they'd never opened, and a legacy they'd never inherit. Her lawyer replies to her email, "Come in tomorrow. Bring everything." She mocked my clothes. I unzipped an estate. The law office was tucked between a yoga studio and a gourmet popcorn shop in a downtown block that had been revitalized with fresh paint and property tax hikes. Nora parked 2 streets over and walked the rest of the way, her steps firm, coat buttoned to the throat. Helen Marks's office still smelled faintly of lemon oil and old contracts. Nora liked that. It reminded her of archives, of places where things were preserved because they mattered. Helen looked up from her desk, her silver bob as neat as her notepad. "You brought it?" Nora unsnapped her worn leather bag and placed the folder down with both hands like a chess player laying her queen. "I did." They worked without small talk, as they always had. Page by page, line by line, clause by clause. Helen read aloud, slowly, stopping only to clarify specifics. Full estate to be inherited by Evan Miles Bennett, sole surviving son? Helen raised an eyebrow. You're removing him? Yes, Nora said. No hesitation. In his place, 3 parties. Helen blinked but didn't flinch. Go on. Elise Monroe, my goddaughter. 40%. Helen made the note. 30 to the Brookfield Public Library for capital improvements, and 30 to the Elizabeth House Women's Shelter. Helen looked up. That's 100, Nora. Nora didn't smile. Let them argue about percentages if they want. That's the test. And your son? He had a full inheritance for 15 years, Nora said. He just didn't know he was living in it. Helen clicked her pen. Would you like to include a disinheritance clause? No. Nora leaned forward, hands folded. I'd like to include a respect clause. Helen paused. If any beneficiary, now or in the future, makes a recorded, written, or otherwise provable statement of insult toward me, they're disqualified. Instant forfeiture. Helen let out a low breath, somewhere between admiration and concern. That's enforceable, but specific. Personal good, Nora said. So was the disrespect. Helen wrote it down. Silence stretched between them, not awkward but deliberate. Nora stared at the wood grain of the table while Helen typed the new draft. She imagined Henry beside her, arms crossed, approving silently the way he used to when she beat him at Scrabble. After an hour, Helen pushed the keyboard away. Expedite? Yes, I want it signed, sealed, and registered before the engagement party. Helen tilted her head. That's soon. I don't need ceremony, Nora said. Just clarity. Helen stood, moved to the cabinet behind her desk, and pulled out the forms for expedited estate processing. Do you need to think on this, Nora? Any part of it? She asked gently. I've been thinking for years, Nora replied. This is just the typing part. Helen offered a quiet nod of respect. They shook hands without fanfare. Nora walked out with a copy of the preliminary draft in her tote. The afternoon sun had shifted, throwing long shadows on the sidewalk. She didn't rush. Back home, she placed the folder beside the tea kettle, the updated file already glowing in her inbox. She opened the fridge, pulled out a slice of lemon tart she'd made earlier in the week, and sat down to enjoy it. For the first time in a long while, it tasted like ownership. Her phone vibrated, a group text. From Clare. Reminder, engagement party is semi-formal. Please don't wear anything musty. Wouldn't want to confuse guests. Nora stared at the message for a full 10 seconds, then calmly closed the phone. The cardigan remained on the chair. But the will? That was airtight. Claire sends a group text. Please don't wear anything musty to the engagement party. She tried to gatekeep fashion. I gatekept the estate. The boutique was not one of the shiny storefronts Claire frequented, no rose gold signage or complimentary champagne. It sat quietly on a side street, tucked between a cobbler and a family-run bakery that still used handwritten price tags. The mannequins in the window didn't scream for attention, they whispered dignity. Nora stepped inside and was immediately met with a hush of soft piano music and the faint smell of lavender starch. A saleswoman with silver hoops and sensible shoes offered a polite nod and returned to folding scarves. Nora took her time. She ran her fingers along the sleeve hems, checking for stitching, for weight, for grace and structure. She didn't want something to impress Claire. She wanted something that would never need defending. She selected a simple slate gray dress with clean lines and elbow-length sleeves. Not trendy, not loud. Timeless. She paired it with a small brooch from her jewelry box at home, Henry's final anniversary gift. Silk, shaped like a swallow in flight. He said it reminded him of how she never made a scene, just exited when it mattered. At the party, Nora arrived exactly 10 minutes after the official start time, just late enough not to look eager. Claire opened the door, her eyes sweeping over Nora from shoes to brooch. She said nothing, but her smile tightened. Inside, guests mingled over Chardonnay and charcuterie boards arranged to resemble flower petals. Claire was in command, pointing out signature cocktails, laughing just a hair too loudly, placing one hand on Evan's shoulder like punctuation. Nora moved silently through the room, greeting those she knew, staying mostly near the bookshelves. Later, as Claire sipped rosé and whispered something sharp about another woman's flats, loud enough for the poor girl to hear, Nora watched. Noted. She didn't flinch, didn't defend, but she logged it, the way librarians log damage, quietly, for internal use. When Claire's eyes darted toward Nora's brooch again, this time longer, assessing, Nora met her gaze, held it, then smiled. Claire turned away first. Back home that night, Nora lit a candle, opened her closet, and pulled out 2 bags of clothes, cardigans with snags, skirts that hadn't been worn in years, a blouse Evan once said made her look too serious. She laid them out carefully, folded them into neat piles, and placed them in donation bags. But the cardigan? The dumpster cardigan? That stayed. She placed it back in the drawer beneath her winter coats, wrapped in tissue paper. Not because it was fragile, because it was loaded. Then she moved to the printer. The new version of the will glided out, page after page of legal language that felt less like vengeance and more like truth being notarized. She slid it into a thick ivory envelope, folded the flap but didn't seal it. Instead, she took a black pen and wrote in her clean cursive, "Opened only if they ask too much." She placed it in her desk drawer, next to the framed photo of Henry holding baby Evan in the backyard, years before ambition had dulled kindness. Her phone rang. Helen's voice came steady over the line. "It's done. Clause is in place. Your estate is legally ironclad." Nora exhaled without sound. No drama. Just the kind of quiet you hear before a storm rolls in. Helen calls, "The clause is in place. Your estate is legally ironclad." They judged my wardrobe. I judged their character. The rain had come soft and steady that morning, tapping gently at the windows like a memory trying to return. Nora stood by the kitchen sink with her hands wrapped around a warm mug, watching the droplets gather on the sill. The house was quiet, too quiet, maybe, but she'd long since made peace with that particular silence. Her phone rang just as she finished her tea. The caller ID flashed a name she hadn't seen in months, Elise Monroe. She answered quickly, her voice gentle but clear. "Elise, sweetheart." "Aunt Nora." The voice on the other end was light, but something in it trembled slightly, like someone who had gotten good at balancing gratitude with caution. "I got your message. I hope everything's okay?" "It is," Nora said, settling into the kitchen chair by the window. "I just wanted to ask you something important." "Of course," Elise replied, the worry still there beneath her words. "What is it?" "I've made some changes to my will," Nora began, "and I've named you as a beneficiary." There was a long pause, followed by a sharp inhale. "Me?" "Yes," Nora said simply. 40%. The rest will go to Brookfield Library and the Elizabeth House Women's Refuge. I didn't want to do it quietly. Not when it affects people I love." Elise sounded stunned. "Aunt Nora? I mean, you helped raise me. You and Uncle Henry, you were like my second parents. But are you sure? Is this okay with Evan?" Nora's gaze drifted to the photo of Henry still perched on the mantel, a black and white image of him in his gardening hat, grinning like he'd just told a bad joke. "It doesn't need to be okay with Evan," she said. "It needs to be right. And this is." There was a pause. Then Elise said softly, "Then thank you. I'm honored. Really." "I know you are," Nora said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's why I called." They talked a little longer, mostly about how Elise's job was going and the new art class she'd signed up for on Tuesday nights. When they hung up, Nora placed the phone back on its stand and allowed herself a single long breath, the kind of breath that comes after. You shift a weight you didn't realize you were carrying. An hour later, as she was organizing documents for Helen, a bright red banner blinked across the top of her email inbox. Alert. Financial inquiry. Action required. She clicked it open. The notification detailed a formal query made through a corporate benefits platform, an anonymous search of estate procedures tied to her name, her assets, and her primary residence. But someone had forgotten that digital footprints rarely stay hidden. The initiating account had a name attached, Clare Bennett. Nora leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. So it had begun. She didn't call Claire. She didn't call Evan either. She called Helen, who picked up on the second ring. "She's fishing," Nora said calmly. Under Evan's company credentials, looking for what she thinks she deserves. Helen didn't sound surprised. I've flagged the query with the estate security monitor. It's traceable. We can use it later if needed. I assume she thinks I won't fight. They always do, Helen said. Until they learn you've already won. That night, Nora prepared a pot of lentils and rice. She cooked slowly, measuring spices with her palm the way Henry used to do. There was something oddly sacred about it, making a meal that required no audience, no praise. As the food simmered on the stove, she stepped into the hallway to pull down a storage box of old winter blankets. She hadn't heard Evan's voice through the floor vent in years, but with the HVAC humming gently, she caught it now, seeping up like a draft. Claire's voice first, sharp and exasperated. Do you think she knows we're checking? She's not dumb, Evan answered, his tone low and flat. But it doesn't matter. The house was always meant for me. She just hasn't accepted that yet. There was a pause, followed by a sound, maybe the dresser drawer slamming shut. And then Evan again. When she's gone, we'll finally have space. Nora stood very still in the hallway. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She didn't even sigh. She just folded the blanket she was holding with both hands and placed it back in the box, the fabric still warm from where it had rested against her chest. Nora overhears Evan say, "When she's gone, we'll finally have space." They wanted me out of the picture, so I erased them from the frame. The morning after Nora overheard her son's quiet betrayal, she didn't cry or pace or break dishes in cinematic anger. Instead, she made her bed with tighter hospital corners than usual and ironed her linen napkins before breakfast. She sat at the dining table with a bowl of oatmeal and ate each bite slowly, as if the silence deserved to be fed too. Then she rose and walked to the hallway closet. From the top shelf, she pulled down 2 large bins and carried them into the living room, placing them near the old oak cabinet that had once been Henry's idea of rustic sophistication. Inside the cabinet were years of carefully arranged photo albums, birthdays, vacations, holidays, graduations. Nora opened the first album and began to remove photos one by one. She worked methodically, choosing only the ones that included Clare, or where Evan looked like a man rehearsing affection rather than living in it. Each photo she pulled out, she placed gently inside one of the bins, stacked, not crumpled. She was not erasing history. She was just storing the parts of it that had stopped belonging to her. After the 6th album, she paused and lifted a small framed picture off the bookshelf. It was from Evan's college graduation. He had his arm around her, cap tilted back, joy radiating from his face. She had given him a check that day, her entire annual bonus from the library, which she'd saved quietly over 12 months. He never asked where the money came from. He had only said, "Thanks, Mom. Claire's gonna love the trip." She placed the frame face down in the bin. By noon, the photos were packed, labeled, and carried to the basement. Back upstairs, she returned to her study and opened the estate planning folder again. There were still pieces to move. She logged into her banking portal and initiated a partial transfer. $200,000 moved directly into the Brookfield Library's Building Endowment Fund. She flagged the transaction as Anonymous Legacy Donor. No plaques, no press releases, just investment, the way Henry would have preferred. After lunch, she walked 2 blocks to the small jeweler with the beveled glass windows. The shop had been there for 50 years, and she had passed it hundreds of times without ever stepping inside. Today she did. She didn't browse. She asked to see the freshwater pearl necklaces. The clerk, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and hands worn from decades of gift wrapping, brought out a black velvet tray. Nora selected a single strand. Simple, cream-toned, not flashy. "Would you like it boxed for a gift?" the woman asked. Nora shook her head. "Number I'll wear at home." Back in her living room, she put the neck, lace away in her jewelry drawer beside the brooch. She didn't plan to wear it to dinner or to any party. It wasn't a statement for them. It was a reminder to herself that ownership could be quiet and elegance didn't ask permission. Later that afternoon, her phone buzzed with a text from Clare. "Hi Nora, just checking. Can we count on you for the rehearsal dinner costs? We're trying to finalize the headcount and vendor payment today." Nora stared at the message for a long time, her thumb hovering over the screen. Then she walked to her desk, pulled out a blank check, wrote it for the exact amount quoted weeks ago, and in firm, even strokes, she wrote "void" across the check in red ink. She placed the check on the side table, snapped a photo of it with her phone, and sent the picture to Claire with one caption beneath it: "Count again." No emojis, no signature, just the weight of restraint, finally breaking form. That evening, as Nora watered the violets in the kitchen window, the phone rang again. Helen's name flashed on the screen. She answered. "Yes?" Helen's voice was clipped, irritated, and unmistakably alert. "Claire just submitted a financial forecast that includes your house as a posthumous asset. She tried to list it under Evan's name. Projected value, full equity." Nora didn't move. She let the information settle like fine dust on polished wood. "She's making it hers before I've even left it." "Yes," Helen said, "but she's not going to get it." Nora looked out at her backyard, at the bird bath Henry had built with his bare hands. "She already lost it," she replied. "She just hasn't noticed yet." Helen calls. "Claire attempted to list your house as part of Evan's future assets. They priced what I built. I withdrew what I offered." The clerk at the county office had a voice like sandpaper and a ring on every finger. She peered over her bifocals at Nora's documentation, blinking twice before pulling up the deed record. "You're the sole title holder," she confirmed, tapping at the keyboard. "What exactly do you want to add to the property file?" "A transfer restriction," Nora replied, setting down a notarized form Helen had prepared. "Irrevocable unless moved into the Bennett Preservation Trust." The clerk looked up again. "That's unusual for a personal residence. Most folks keep things simpler for heirs." Nora offered a faint smile. "This isn't for heirs. It's for history." She waited while the system updated. 30 minutes later, the clerk printed confirmation that her home could no longer be passed by will, sale, or suggestion. Only the trust, under her direction, would dictate what happened after she was gone. Back home, Nora sat at the edge of her bed and reread the new paperwork. She felt the way she used to feel after installing a fresh lock. No louder, just safer. The next day, she visited a hardware store tucked between an antique bookstore and a bakery that still sold sourdough by weight. She chose a discreet, high-quality surveillance camera. No flashy brand, no complicated installation, just something that could run quietly and see clearly. She paid in cash, declined the receipt. The camera was installed by afternoon, discreetly nestled on a bookshelf, its lens tucked between hardcover copies of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn and The Ethics of Silence. She tested the feed on her iPad. The image was sharp enough to read the text on the spine of a library book. Then she waited. It took 3 days. Claire arrived on a Tuesday morning, unannounced, with a Tupperware of extra quiche and a bottle of elderflower tonic she'd once rolled her eyes at during brunch. Evan was at work, and Claire's visit wasn't mentioned ahead of time. Nora opened the door, accepted the offering without comment, and stepped aside. Claire's smile was tight but practiced. "Just thought I'd check in, see how you've been doing. It's been a while since we had real time to talk." Nora offered her tea, which Claire declined. She said she was already caffeinated, then wandered through the house with the aimless politeness of someone casing a boutique for things not marked "for sale." Claire stopped at the hallway table where Nora had recently cleared the framed photos. She ran a fingertip along the empty surface, as if trying to spot a watermark of where she should have existed. Then she turned to Nora. "I always loved this house," she said. "Evan and I were saying the other day how, well, it's got good bones. Wouldn't need much work, just new fixtures, some modernizing." Nora didn't answer. She was looking directly at Claire, but thinking about the footage already uploading to her encrypted cloud account. Claire drifted toward the study next, her heels clicking against the hardwood like a metronome trying to rush the beat. She stood at the desk for a few seconds too long, eyes scanning the folders. Then she took out her phone and snapped 2 quick photos, one of the bookshelf, one of the drawer handles. "I should get going," Claire said, returning to the kitchen with a light laugh. "Tell Evan I stopped by, and if you ever need anything, well, just say the word." Nora nodded slowly. "I will." After the door closed and the sound of Claire's tires faded down the street, Nora opened her iPad. She rewound the footage, watched Claire lean, scroll, scan, snap. Then she created a new folder on her secure drive. Inheritance. Audit. Claire Bennett. Visit 1. She uploaded the file without flinching, labeled it, time-stamped it, watched the progress bar fill. By the end of the day, she had locked the folder behind a 28-character passphrase only she could remember. That night, the mail arrived late. Tucked between a political flyer and a magazine subscription renewal was a plain white envelope. No return address. Nora opened it at the kitchen counter. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Typed. Private Investigator Engagement Agreement. Client, Clare Bennett. Nora read the entire document twice. Then she lit a single candle, poured herself a bourbon she'd been saving, and toasted nothing in particular. Nora receives a letter from a private investigator. Claire hired one. They said I was forgetful. I remembered everything. The next morning, Nora walked into her study with a notepad in one hand and a folder labeled Personal Correspondence in the other. She closed the door behind her, not because she feared being interrupted, but because what she was about to do deserved ceremony. The house was silent. The sort of silence that arrives only when dignity has been sharpened into focus. She sat at the desk and turned to a fresh page. June 17th, 2023, Claire at brunch told waitress, "Some people have vintage taste, some just smell that way." October 12th, 2022, group text thread. Claire said, "Let's not let Nora decorate again unless it's a retirement home." February 6th, 2022, Claire's Instagram comment on Nora's coat, "We love a pioneer woman cosplay." Nora flipped open the folder. Dozens of small things. Birthday cards returned unsigned, passive-aggressive thank you notes, photos cropped to exclude her. She had never kept them with the intention of cataloging, but now they formed a pattern. Small insults, repeated like fine print on a bad contract. They hadn't registered as wounds at the time, but today, each one gleamed like evidence. She opened her email and typed a message to Helen. Subject, Supplemental Materials, Respect Clause Violation. Helen, please find attached the beginnings of what I believe constitutes a sustained pattern of documented disrespect, verbal, digital, social. Let me know what qualifies as admissible under clause parameters. Best, Nora. She attached a scanned PDF, 13 pages, carefully collated, and hit send. By late afternoon, Helen had replied, Subject, Respect Clause Violation, received. Nora, this is exactly what we needed. I've labeled this Exhibit A in your estate file. Pattern of verbal elder disrespect. I'll keep collecting anything further you provide. Nora closed her laptop and allowed herself a rare moment of vindication. Not joy, not revenge, just the assurance that someone, somewhere, finally named it for what it was. She poured herself another cup of tea and glanced out the window, watching a neighbor's golden retriever pull at its leash. The world outside her home continued in its usual hum, but inside, something had shifted. The foundation under her legacy was no longer assumed. It was secured. That night, while brushing her teeth, Nora's phone buzzed on the nightstand. She wiped her hands on a towel and walked over. It was a screenshot from Elise. No message, just the image. Claire's latest Facebook post. A meme. A split image of a Chanel logo and a Goodwill tag. Captioned, "When the old money smells like old laundry." Nora's breath didn't catch. Her pulse didn't rise. It was confirmation, not surprise. She screenshot the post, emailed it directly to Helen with one line beneath it, "Include this." Then, without hesitation, she opened her own social media profile. A modest one, mostly used to like Elise's art posts and follow the library's book club announcements. She drafted a status update. "Every estate has a story. I'm just editing mine." No hashtags, no photos, no tags, just the words. Within minutes, Elise loved the post. A retired colleague from the library commented with a clapping emoji. One of Nora's old neighbors sent a private message saying, "Are you okay? That sounds heavy." Nora didn't reply to any of them. She simply turned her phone face down and went to bed. But before sleep could settle, her screen lit up one last time. A message preview from Claire, sent privately to Evan. "I'm done pretending. She's a joke." Claire messages Evan. "I'm done pretending. She's a joke. They laughed at me. My lawyer didn't." By mid-morning, the clouds outside Nora's window had begun to stack low over the town, casting a quiet grayness across her living room. The light made the corners of the room softer, less defined, like everything was holding its breath. Nora sat at her desk with a legal pad in front of her and Helen's latest email glowing on the screen. Subject: Mutual Respect Clause. Final Language Review. Nora, as requested, here is the amendment. Should any beneficiary attempt to contest the terms of this will, either through formal legal action or informal documented intimidation, they forfeit their claim. The estate activates in full only upon proof of mutual respect between beneficiaries. Confirm and will file. Nora reread it slowly, lips pressed together in a neutral line. It was precisely what she needed. Not vengeance dressed as justice, but clarity dressed as closure, the kind that couldn't be argued, only accepted or lost. She picked up the pen, signed her approval, scanned the document, and sent it back without ceremony. Then she waited. It didn't take long. Clare called that evening, just after dinner, a time carefully chosen to seem casual. Nora let it ring once before answering. "Hello?" There was a pause, followed by a soft intake of breath, then Claire's voice, low and brittle. "Nora, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." Nora didn't reply. "You've been so generous," Claire continued, "and I think I let stress get the better of me. Planning the wedding, and trying to manage things. I wanted to come by, to talk, face to face." "You're welcome to," Nora said, "tomorrow at 10. She ended the call before Claire could respond. The next morning, the sun returned, sharp and bright. Nora opened the windows to let the air in and brewed a fresh pot of English breakfast tea. She set out 2 cups, 2 linen napkins, and 1 folder. Claire arrived wearing soft makeup and a cream blouse, her expression carefully arranged between sorrow and hope. She held a small box of shortbread cookies Nora didn't acknowledge. They sat. Claire sipped tea, nervously folding the edge of her napkin between her fingers. "I know I haven't always been gracious, but I truly do appreciate you. And Evan does too. We want to do things right. Moving forward." Nora nodded, the kind of slow nod people use when they've already turned the page but are still being polite enough to listen. She reached for the folder on the table, opened it, and slid the top page across to Claire. Claire glanced down at the document, eyes scanning, her brow furrowed. "What is this?" "The new clause," Nora replied evenly, "filed and final. If either party contests the will by legal action or recorded disrespect, they forfeit their inheritance." Claire's eyes widened. "You can't—" "It's already done," Nora said, calmly lifting her cup. "I didn't write this for negotiation. I wrote it for protection." Claire's hands began to tremble. She blinked quickly, setting the page down. "I didn't mean any harm, Nora, truly." "You judged my smell," Nora said, tilting her head slightly. "I judged your silence." Claire's face flushed with a mix of guilt and something else, fear, maybe, or the realization that the performance had ended and the curtain wasn't coming down for her benefit. She reached for a second cookie she wouldn't eat. Nora watched her with stillness that wasn't angry, only final. Claire left without finishing her tea. That evening, Nora received a text from Elise. "Evan just called. Asked if you were okay. Said, 'She's too calm. Something's off.'" Nora didn't reply. She simply placed the folder back into the drawer, closed it with 2 fingers, and turned on the record player in the corner of the room. Ella Fitzgerald's voice filled the house like a breeze through open windows. The kind of calm that scares people is the kind built on foundation, and Nora had just poured the concrete herself. Evan calls his sister Elise. "Something's off. She's too calm." They waited for me to fall apart. I filed instead. The sky had turned a muted porcelain by the time Nora returned from the notary's office, the kind of cold blue overcast that never committed to rain. She set her gloves on the entryway table, folded neatly side by side, and walked straight to the cabinet beneath the stairs. Inside was a small leather folio labeled Final Arrangements. She hadn't opened it in years. She sat down on the living room rug, legs crossed like she was back in story time at the library, and flipped through the contents. The original instructions had been practical, outdated, and far too accommodating. Full-service memorial, reception at the community center, a guest list based on obligation rather than affection. At the time, she had written them as a kindness to Evan, ease the logistics, spare him the details. Now, she edited every line. She selected a modest cremation package with no viewing, no procession, no luncheon. She prepaid the costs in full. The only guests were to be invited by name. Elise would be the sole speaker if she chose to speak at all. Nora checked the no flowers box and, instead, requested donation to the Brookfield Women's Literacy Fund. It wasn't sadness guiding her revisions. It was precision. After finalizing the new instructions, she slipped them into a sealed envelope labeled Elise for someday, then filed them away in her desk. No drama, just preparedness. Later that afternoon, she walked to the bedroom closet and pulled out the flannel pajama set she had owned for over a decade. Soft, faded, dependable. She folded it slowly, set it aside, and replaced it with a new one she had seen in a shop window the week prior. It was satin, midnight blue, with white piping along the collar and cuffs. She had hesitated at first. It felt indulgent, but today it felt earned. She placed the tagless pair in her drawer with quiet ceremony. In the early evening, Nora visited the town's art museum for the first time in over 5 years. She moved slowly through the exhibits, stopping in front of a watercolor series on migration, then a sculpture fashioned from broken clocks and piano keys. No one recognized her, which suited her perfectly. She stood longest in front of an oil painting of a woman sitting alone at a cafe, her hands folded on a napkin. Her face turned toward a window no one else in the frame seemed to notice. When she returned home, the mail was already waiting on the counter. In the stack was a white envelope from the antiquarian auction house she had corresponded with last fall. She opened it at the kitchen table and unfolded the check inside. Her first edition of Wuthering Heights, complete with Bronte's Marginalia, had sold. The amount was almost vulgar. She smiled at it for exactly 5 seconds before endorsing the back and routing 25% to the literacy program she'd once helped launch in secret. Quiet wealth in quiet motion. The rest went into the trust under a placeholder marked Future Female Readers, Unrestricted Fund. As she placed the check stub in her filing drawer, her phone buzzed. Claire. We should take new family pictures soon, maybe in time for the holidays. I'll text Evan. We can all coordinate colors again. Nora stared at the screen for a moment, then typed her reply. Only those in the will make the wall. She hit send and powered off the phone. That night, after her bath and tea, Nora sat by her bedroom window with her iPad open. One by one, she began removing Claire's name from every shared digital document: healthcare proxy, financial authorization forms, the online obituary planner she had pre-scheduled for the local paper. No alert would be sent, no message would be triggered. Clare would simply disappear from the infrastructure of Nora's life, like a bookmark removed from a story she no longer intended to finish. She didn't tell anyone she was doing it. She didn't need to. Because the kind of peace Nora had cultivated wasn't about forgiveness, it was about formatting. Claire's name is removed from all shared digital files and health proxy backups. She thought I'd need her. I unfriended her estate access. Nora had always believed in paper trails, receipts, signatures, notarized margins. But in the last few weeks, she had come to appreciate the quieter kind of evidence: metadata, logins, access logs, digital permissions. She spent that morning in her study, one tab open for each system that had ever been connected to her name. She started with the pharmacy. Claire had added herself years ago as an emergency contact after Nora's minor surgery, a detail Nora had almost forgotten. She removed the name with 2 clicks. Next, the hospital portal. Claire's access revoked, the funeral home's planning dashboard, Claire's contact information deleted. The estate file backups Helen kept on the cloud had never been accessible to anyone but Nora. Still, she changed the passwords anyway. Then she opened the old shared spreadsheet Evan had once created to manage wedding RSVPs. Claire had copied the template and used it for the rehearsal dinner headcount. Nora removed her name from the contributor column. It took less than an hour to dissolve Claire's presence entirely. When it was done, Nora leaned back in her chair and looked at her hands, not trembling, not tense, just steady. It occurred to her, briefly, how many years those hands had passed napkins, picked up dropped forks, clasped in prayer beside people who now viewed her as a ledger item. The phone rang before noon. Claire. Nora didn't pick up. The call went to voicemail, then was immediately followed by a text. "What is this?" "The caterer just called. You pulled your name off the bridal invoice and now we're liable for the deposit. You agreed to cover this. This is insane. Call me." Nora watched the message blink once, then disappear from her screen as she archived the conversation. By the time her landline rang again, this time Helen, she was already placing a tray of madeleines into the oven. "Nora," Helen said. She left me a voicemail, yelling, demanding clarification on why she's been financially abandoned. "I'm sending a formal cease and desist for harassment. She may try to escalate." "Let her," Nora replied, folding her dish towel with the same care she used when sealing legal envelopes. "She's unraveling," Helen said. "I can't say I'm surprised." "She doesn't know how to function without an audience," Nora said, "and now she's realizing I've left the theater." That afternoon, Elise arrived without announcing herself, just the sound of light footsteps on the porch, followed by a gentle knock Nora recognized even before she looked up from her book. Elise held a bouquet of fresh peonies and wore an oversized denim jacket that reminded Nora of the summers Elise used to spend with them as a child, curled up on the porch with library books and popsicles. "I just thought you might like some color in the house," Elise said, stepping into the living room. "I do," Nora replied. "Thank you." They spent the next 2 hours baking almond bread and swapping stories that belonged to no one but the two of them. Nora let Elise sift the flour the way she had taught her at age 10, slow, wide arcs over the bowl, and even played the old jazz station on the radio, the one Henry had always pretended not to enjoy but never turned off. As the bread cooled, Elise looked over and said, "You seem lighter." Nora didn't respond right away. She poured tea, handed Elise a cup, and then finally replied, "I'm not lighter. I'm just no longer being carried by anyone who resented the weight." They sat in silence, sipping slowly. By the time Elise left, the sun had shifted behind the treetops, painting gold shadows across the entryway tile. That evening, as Nora prepared for bed, she found a letter tucked halfway through the mail stack. Slightly crumpled, sealed hastily. Her name was handwritten on the front in thick, impatient ink. She opened it. The letter was brief, printed, no signature. "This has gone too far." Nora folded the letter once, then again, and placed it, uncreased and unshaken, in the folder labeled Estate, Non-Legal Noise. Claire sends a letter titled, "This has gone too far." She mocked my scent. I erased her scent from my legacy. Nora read the letter again the next morning, standing in the kitchen with the envelope still warm from the radiator where she'd accidentally set it. The typeface was generic, the message impatient, and the absence of a signature more revealing than any accusation it contained. "This has gone too far." She held it between her fingers for another moment, feeling its weight, or lack thereof, then walked to the shredder tucked beneath the counter. The motor buzzed for less than 4 seconds. Strips of inked complaint spilled into the bin like overcooked spaghetti. "Far enough," she murmured, brushing her palms together as if cleansing them of dust. In the study, the morning light poured in at an angle that touched her desk and nothing else. It felt like permission. She reached for the manila folder labeled Final Will, certified copy, pulled out the newly printed version she'd had Helen send last week, and laid it flat against the blotter. With the pen Henry had once given her for their 30th anniversary, fountain tip, navy ink, she uncapped it, flipped to the final page, and wrote in the margin beneath her signature, "Disrespect smells stronger than mothballs." She let the ink dry, then folded the pages gently, creased but never crumpled. She placed them in a forest green folder with gold trim and wrapped the whole thing in cream paper, tying it with a single strand of navy ribbon. Later that afternoon, she walked 3 blocks to Elise's apartment, her boots making clean, deliberate contact with the pavement. Elise greeted her at the door with damp hands and a laugh. "Sorry, it's pie crust day." "I won't keep you," Nora said. "I just brought something. For someday." Elise hesitated. "Should I open it?" "No," Nora said with a small shake of her head. "Not yet. But know that what's inside is yours, because you always treated me like I was still someone, not just a function." Elise didn't argue or cry. She took the package with both hands and nodded. Nora left with no lingering glances. That evening, she returned home and opened her closet. From the back, she retrieved the emerald green garment bag she had never used. Bought on clearance nearly a decade ago in a moment of wishful indulgence. Inside it was a dress. Not for a funeral, not for a dinner, not for an apology tour or a public reckoning. A satin column, soft as breath, in the shade of pressed gardenia leaves. It shimmered faintly, catching the light in waves. Nora stepped into it slowly, carefully, as if slipping into a memory she'd reserved for after the storm. She zipped it herself. No mirror, no heels, no audience. Then she stepped into the living room. No music, just the sound of the clock above the mantel, keeping time like a witness. She lifted her arms, bent her knees slightly, and began to move. Not grandly, not with flair, but with quiet, azured rhythm. A sway, a turn, a spin that ended in stillness. She hadn't danced since Henry's last birthday. He'd been too tired that night, but she remembered the song he'd requested anyway. She bowed her head and whispered into the silence, "For you, this time." Afterward, she changed back into her robe and carefully placed the dress in a cedar-lined box beside the folded cardigan, both of them now catalogued under a new category. Not forgotten, just reclaimed. The last thing she did that night was place an order online for a small wall plaque. It would arrive in 5 to 7 business days. Gold-lettered on cream enamel. No border, no frills, just judged, survived, documented. She chose expedited shipping. Then she poured herself a splash of brandy and sat down on the couch, legs curled beneath her like they had so often been in her quieter days. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. A text from Helen. "A publisher liked your blog post. They want to talk about an essay collection." Nora leaned back into the couch, one hand over her chest where the brooch usually sat, and smiled. Helen texts, "A publisher liked your blog post. They waited for me to die. I lived louder." The essay went live on a Thursday, buried halfway down the homepage of a small digital literary magazine Nora had followed for years. She hadn't told anyone, not Elise, not Helen, not even the editor who requested it, how personal the title felt when she finally clicked submit. Smelled like dust, lived like diamonds. She hadn't expected much. A few thoughtful comments maybe, the quiet camaraderie of a niche readership. But by Friday night, it had been shared over 6,000 times. By Sunday, nearly 50,000. The piece, a reflective blend of memoir and meditation, traced everything from the day she found her first gray hair to the day her daughter-in-law called her cardigan a thrift store casualty. It wove memory with clarity, humor with spine. She didn't name names. She didn't have to. The comments poured in. "My mother would have loved this. She deserved this voice. Cried at my desk at work. I called my grandmother after reading. Thank you," Helen called that Monday morning, her voice somewhere between laughter and disbelief. "You're officially a phenomenon," she said. "A library board in New Hampshire wants to reprint it as part of their Women's Wisdom series." "I suppose they've overlooked the sarcasm," Nora said, sipping tea. No, Helen replied. They're praising it. By Wednesday, a community arts collective in town offered to host a public reading. Helen offered to organize. Elise offered to drive. Nora didn't argue. She wore the brooch that night. And a navy wool dress. Not the green satin, not yet. On stage, beside a low-glass podium, the old wool cardigan sat framed in a shadow box. The plaque below read, "Owned, worn, remembered." The audience was a constellation of faces. Daughters in their 20s, grandmothers in shawls, women in headscarves and thrifted blazers and statement pins that whispered rebellion. When Nora read the final paragraph aloud, a hush rippled through the room like breath held in reverence. They said I smelled like yesterday, but yesterday built the road they drive on today. Tears fell openly. Applause came like a wave, slow at first, then full. Afterward, Elise hugged her in the wings. You didn't need to be fashionable, she whispered. You were formidable. Nora didn't respond. She didn't need to. That night, back home, her inbox buzzed with event photos and interview requests. The cardigan photo had made it to the trending tab. Her name was being hashtagged, though she refused to check what that meant exactly. There was, however, one message she did open. From Clare. Just a single sentence. I'd like to talk. Things have gotten out of hand. Nora didn't reply. She scrolled to the top of the screen, selected Block Contact, and tapped once. The screen refreshed. Clare disappeared. It felt less like slamming a door and more like removing a number from an old rotary dial. There'd be no residue. Then, for the first time in weeks, she opened the will again, not out of duty, but because she had one last paragraph to write, a final footnote, a clause not born from anger, but completion. She flipped to the last page, turned it over, and wrote, "This is the clean ending you didn't see coming." She underlined clean once, folded the paper back into the document sleeve, slid it into the drawer beneath her music box, beside the dried lavender sachet she'd made the year after Henry passed. As she reached for her reading glasses, the phone rang. Not a buzz, a landline ring. The kind that still felt honest. "Hello?" A polite voice answered. "Ms. Bennett, this is Charlotte Langley with the State Heritage Museum. We recently came across a letter correspondence in our donor archive, handwritten letters between your husband and the late curator, Mitchell Payne. We'd like to request permission to feature them in a fall exhibit on quiet activism and unsung builders of legacy. Would you be willing to speak with us?" Nora stared out the window as a breeze stirred the porch wind chimes. The past was calling, but this time not to haunt, to honor. Museum calls. They want to feature her late husband's letters. My clothes aged. My estate matured. The museum exhibit opened in late October, framed by gold leaves and the scent of cooling air that always reminded Nora of pressed cider and sharpened pencils. She didn't attend the unveiling, though they offered. She preferred to contribute without appearing, an influence without spectacle. Instead, she marked the occasion quietly by driving to the Brookfield University Special Collections Library and delivering a donation box with gloved hands and a signed release form. Inside, Henry's annotated first editions, his college lecture notes, a leather-bound notebook titled Designs for Quiet Things. She watched the archivist unwrap the materials like a parent receiving a newborn, careful not to let the pages bend. She didn't stay long. She didn't need to. The next morning, her house was still. The autumn light warmed the baseboards like honey. It had been days since she checked the doorbell camera, weeks since she received a text that required defense or diplomacy. The quiet was earned, not escaped. She made herself tea in the mug Elise had once painted for her, ceramic, chipped at the handle. On the living room wall, above the record player, hung the new painting, Elise's gift. It was a portrait, but not a formal one. Nora sat in a high-backed armchair, her cardigan wrapped around her shoulders, a book resting in her lap. No makeup, no pearls. The background was subtle, her own shelves and side tables drawn in soft focus. But her eyes were sharp. She had not posed for it. Elise had painted it from memory. "You always looked most like yourself when you didn't know anyone was watching," Elise had explained. Nora had stood in front of it for a long while after hanging it. Now, it blended into the room like something that had always belonged there. That afternoon, Nora opened a fresh document on her laptop. The title came quickly: "Inheritance Isn't Entitlement, a Guide for the Loved, Not the Loud." It wasn't meant to be literature. It was policy, built with the kind of insight only a woman who'd been patronized and overlooked could write. She included chapters on boundaries, verbal microaggressions, end-of-life dignity, and the difference between offering care and claiming ownership. It took her 2 days. She submitted it to the State Eldercare Council with a short note: "Use it, lose it, edit it. But know this, someone needed to say it." They not only accepted it, they printed it. 10 counties adopted the booklet as part of their annual caregiver training packet. Helen forwarded the publication notice with an all-caps subject line: "We've been printed." Nora printed 1 copy for herself and tucked it inside the front cover of her estate binder. Not as a legal reference, as a reminder. Later that week, she sat by her front window with a crossword and a slice of lemon cake. Her feet were bare. The cardigan draped softly over her shoulders, no longer a defense but a comfort. No silk, no scent, no apology. The house didn't smell like old linen anymore. It smelled like rosemary from the front porch planter, like clean floors and sunlight, like memory, but curated. The phone rang at dusk. Voicemail. No name. Nora waited until the light dimmed and shadows stretched across the room like long sighs before pressing play. Claire's voice, tight with disbelief. "You're unbelievable. You know that. All of this over what? A sweater? A joke? A tone? You've made your point, Nora. Everyone sees you now. Congratulations. I hope you're proud." There was a pause, and for a moment Nora thought the call had ended. Then Claire's voice again, quieter but sharp as vinegar. "I was never trying to take your place. I was just trying to survive you." The message ended. Nora pressed delete. She didn't save it, didn't file it, didn't even frown. She simply turned her head and looked at the portrait again. Not just a woman in a cardigan, a woman who had made survival look graceful. Claire's voicemail. "You're unbelievable." She wrinkled her nose. I sealed the envelope. The last morning came the way all well-earned endings should. Not with ceremony, but with clarity. The light spilled in through the east window, brushing gently across the edge of Nora's writing desk. It fell in a square of warm gold right where she placed the frame. The will sat inside it, signed, sealed, and now witnessed, with a notary's embossed stamp pressed into the bottom corner like a full stop at the end of a sentence too long unspoken. It faced outward. Not for vanity, but for confirmation. The story was not only written, it had been published, archived, and bound. Beside the frame stood Elise's portrait, its edges still smelling faintly of turpentine and lavender. Together they made a kind of altar, not to death, but to decisiveness. Nora ran her hand across the edge of the wood and nodded once to herself, as if approving the alignment of a final paragraph. Then she opened the bottom drawer of her roll top. The safe had no biometrics, no lights, no beeps, just a 3-digit dial and a click that had always felt satisfying. She opened it, retrieved the envelope marked transfer, Elise only, and placed a small brass key inside. Then she sealed the flap and wrote 1 line across the front in her careful, slanted handwriting. "When you're ready." She slid it into a padded mailer and added Elise's address. No return, no note, just delivery. Then she walked to the closet and reached for the archival box she'd ordered the week prior. Acid-free, linen-wrapped, discreet. Inside, she gently laid the cardigan. She folded it only once, the way she used to fold Henry's sweaters before his department talks. Tucked beside it was a single card, written by hand. The only thing that aged here was patience. She closed the lid and wrapped the cotton tie securely around the corners. No tape, no lock, no metaphor too obvious. The sun was past its peak when she returned to the kitchen. She brewed herself a final cup of Earl Grey and placed a single Madeleine on the saucer's edge. On the notepad beside her mug, she jotted down one last sentence, just 6 words. The epilogue no one had asked for, but the one she'd always intended to write. Your words shaped your portion. Mine shaped my legacy. She capped her pen and rested it across the top of the page. No flair, no announcement, just authorship. As the candle on the windowsill reached its final half-inch of wax, Nora stood, walked to the living room, and pulled the curtain shut. She let the house dim, let the silence take the shape of something earned, not endured. She changed into her midnight blue pajamas, the satin soft against her skin, and tucked herself into bed. No television, no music, just peace. By the time the sky faded fully into indigo, she was asleep, her breathing soft, her hands unclenched, no tension in her brow, no weight on her chest, no unfinished business. And on the desk by the window, where the light would return in the morning, sat a framed will, a painted likeness, and a life concluded with intention. A woman who had been judged, a woman who had survived, a woman who had written every word of her own conclusion. I didn't smell like money. I just owned it.